David? David? Are you there, David? You should be able to mute yourself now. There you are.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Right then. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. And good afternoon, Michelle. Just give a couple more minutes to let people join.
Yes, please.
Before we start
Thank you.
this webinar. So I hope the rain stopped for everyone. It's been quite a traumatic few days of heavy precipitation and some tragic events around the country. Very unfortunate. Right. Okay. I'll get going because the first bit is the boring stuff about me, because I've been asked to do this.
Give me a sec. Let me start the recording then.
Oh, don't do that. Don't record me now. That means I can't say anything.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I got told that. No, you can start.
Okay. I'll start the recording now.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Viner. I'm the co-chair of the UK Climate Programme's Knowledge Network. I was I was voted by colleagues on the UKCP Knowledge Network as co-chair. So it's a fascinating opportunity to get to know more people around the network and also learn more about what's going on. And really pleased that so far 60 people have attended this, and hopefully more will join and more will watch the videos and listen to the recordings online. I've spent all my career, last 30 odd years, working in climate change, half of that time at the University of East Anglia's Climatic Research Unit, a bit of it in UK government, and then nearly half of it in the private sector, McDonald, Macquarie, and others on the way. I've also been involved in the IPCC process for far too long. I had the pleasure and honour of attending the scoping meeting of the IPCC Cities report a couple of weeks ago in Riga, and that was a fascinating experience. It's really impressive to see how that has diversified, and the audience, the participants have diversified. There were 70 odd invited people who were nominated by the government, and I was the only one from the UK, whereas maybe 20 years ago, 20% would have been from the UK. So that diversification is good, gives a lot more diverse range of opinions and perspectives from right across the globe. I do mention this occasionally, but my wife has been complaining about how cold it is. She doesn't work full time. You know, every day I have off, it's cold and wet and miserable. Why is it so cold? Well, I have to remind her that so far for 2024, looking at Central England temperature record, and I do talk about this because it is a really valuable resource on the UK Met Office site. The temperature so far to May is 2.39 above the long-term average that Celsius above the long-term average that the CET uses. The previous warmest years on record, 2022 and 2023, were about 1.68, 1.66. So far this year, that is way off the scale. And that's really alarming. If it's not to break the record, it's got to be below 1.23 for the remainder of the year, which means we're probably going to have my wife will still keep moaning about it being cold. So yeah, so it's an amazing departure from what we're seeing, and a real jump, over half a Celsius more than the previous warmest year so far. It may change again. The UK subject to British Isles is subject to very varying weather, which drives our climate. But we're looking at the warmth of the Atlantic, the warmth of the Northern Hemisphere in general is really pushing up our temperature. They're not necessarily manifesting itself in what people might call barbecue days, or what the Met Office did. Talking about the Met Office, I'm not associated with the Met Office in any way. I'm here just representing the community, the Knowledge Network. I've worked with the Met Office all my career. I do know individuals there very well, but I'm not part of the UK Met Office in any sense at all. So I'd now like to just introduce our speaker for today, Michelle Spillar. Michelle is from AtkinsRéalis. So I presume Atkins has partnered up with someone called Realis. It used to be just Atkins in my day. And she's talking about applying UKCP18 products for climate screening and risk assessment to inform Transport Scotland's trunk road adaptation plan. Michelle is an associate consultant with AtkinsRéalis, and I presume I have to call it AtkinsRéalis now, or your brand police are going to come and tell me off. And Michelle has 20 years experience at the interface between weather and climate research, innovation and partnerships. Michelle has an MSc in applied meteorology and extensive experience leading and delivering climate and net consultancy services to the UK, European energy, water and renewable energy clients. Michelle also led teams at the interface of research at the business at the University of Exeter, and Michelle's current role supports clients across the UK and internationally to understand climate risk and enhance their climate resilience. So just before I start, just a few housekeeping points. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A. Please post the questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. I got this wrong once. Couldn't see any questions, but they're all in. I was looking at the chat. Please remain muted, and unless you're unable to speak. I think everyone's on automatic mute. Anyway, the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared on the Met Office Science and Services YouTube channel. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please don't contact me. Please contact the UKCP user network or use a chat function if you want a quicker turnaround. And then at the end of the talk and the Q&A, I'll introduce the next webinar series. So without much further ado, and I've been rattling on far too long, can I please? You're not meant to smile and laugh at that one, Michelle. Just oh no, you haven't. Can I introduce Michelle? Michelle, over to you, please. And hopefully you've got control of the slides. So thank you.
Yeah, I should have control now. So thank you, David, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Today, I'll be talking about a recent project that we've completed across a broad team at AtkinsRéalis, and it's I'm going to focus on the climate screening and risk assessment to inform Transport Scotland's trunk road adaptation plan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've used the UKCP18 data within this project. This is a very recent project for us, so there'll be some level of detail that I won't share, and Transport Scotland will be publishing the trunk road adaptation plan over the coming months, so you'll be able to see more detail as it's published. So today I'm going to focus on three areas. I'm just going to give you a little introduction into the challenges facing the trunk road network when it comes to climate adaptation. I'm going to talk a little bit, as I said, about using the UKCP18 data within the climate risk assessment process, and then I'm going to move on to talk about how that's informed the adaptation plan that we've drafted for Transport Scotland. So to start off with the adaptation challenges facing the trunk road network, it's a bit of a mouthful. On the slide here, you can see both the trunk road network for Transport Scotland, so all of the main routes, and you'll see some of those are different colours, and that just relates to the management regions that Transport Scotland use. And you can also see in red and amber the transport risks that were prioritised through the third climate change risk assessment. Those in red are those where further action is needed, and those in amber are those where more information is required. So you can see a really wide range of risks there, and these cover multiple hazards from a climate perspective. So if we take the one on the top left, for example, it's covering high and low temperatures, high wind and lightning affecting the transport network. Well, what does that mean for providers such as Transport Scotland? Well, Transport Scotland are responsible for the trunk road network, and they're responsible to Scottish Government for provision of that network and keeping it reliable. They also have a number of adaptation commitments, and you can see these on the left, number of the government legislative pieces that they need to respond to. As such, they've created their own strategy and their approach to climate change and risk assessment, and the trunk road adaptation plan forms part of that strategy, and that's what we delivered within this project. So how did we make use of the UKCP18 data for this? Well, first of all, it's worth saying this is a multi-stage project. We involved stakeholders at every stage within the programme, so lots of involvement from the teams that are dealing with these issues day to day. And you can see that with all the workshops that I've sort of highlighted on the slide there. The process really started with us fully understanding how well developed Transport Scotland's current approach was. We then moved on to undertake a high-level climate screening, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment, a full climate change risk assessment, and then we started to input the outputs we'd received into form an adaptation plan and to think about how Transport Scotland might go on to monitor that adaptation activity over the future. Today I'm going to be focused more on the right-hand side of the diagram, the climate screening and the climate risk assessment, as that's where we've made use of the UKCP18 data. So to talk a little more about the climate screening stage, this was the first stage of the project. We considered 8 climate hazards, so that was high temperatures, cold spells, strong winds, landslides, 3 types of flooding, so coastal, fluvial, so river flooding, and pluvial surface water flooding. Was that 8 within the assessment? We made use of the HAD UK 5K gridded data to form our climate baseline, and that's what we used within the initial screening stage. Within this stage, we were looking at calculating the risk as a combination of the hazard, the vulnerability, and the exposure. And I'm going to talk a little more about each of those now. So for the hazard, as I mentioned, we've looked at these 8 hazards. We've downloaded the HAD UK data for the 1980 to the 81 to 2000 period, and we've also made use of additional data from SEPA and also the British Geological Survey. We've transformed that data into useful climate indicators by applying thresholds that would be relevant to the trunk road network. For the exposure, we've then mapped that data to the trunk road network, and I'll show some little examples of how we've done that in a moment. And we also made use of asset data from Transport Scotland, and we've mapped that against the hazard data. So this would be things like the condition of the road network and of the structures, the significant structures within that network. And we then calculated the risk as a combination of all of those factors. So what did that give us by way of outputs? It's enabled us to map the asset risk in quite a high level of detail right across the Transport Scotland network. So you can see an example there of that on the right. So this is a landslide score from the risk screening, and you can see that we are effectively RAG rating that risk on a red, amber, green basis and creating a score that sits behind that but enables it to be easily visible and usable by Transport Scotland. And you can see there are some areas where we're flagging a really significant risk in the present day. We were also able to summarise some of that information to help Transport Scotland understand how much of the road network is at risk of these hazards. So in this example, cold spells, and where that hazard is most concentrated. And that's important because of the different management regions and the different operators managing those regions. We've then summarised that into an easy to use final risk score to enable some prioritisation within Transport Scotland, but this is developed further in the next stage, the full risk assessment that we undertook. So we then moved on to look at the future period and to undertake the full risk assessment. So for this part of the project, we made use of the UKCP18 probabilistic projections. We were looking at the RCP6 and RCP 8.5, and we were focused on the 2050s and the 2080s in terms of the timeline. And those choices were all made in conversation with the client and looking at what the client required. Now here, a different approach was taken to the risk, and this was to align with Transport Scotland's internal risk register. What we want really to see from the outcomes of this project is that the risk is incorporated into existing organisational processes, as opposed to being something separate that sits off to one side. So what we've done here is looked at likelihood and impact, and that's enabled us to calculate the future risk scoring in a manner that aligns with Transport Scotland's risk register and integrates into their existing risk register and provides an update to that. So for the risk, we focused on likelihood and impact, as I mentioned. The likelihood was the frequency of the occurrence of some of these events throughout the UKCP model periods that we analysed. And then the impact we looked at both qualitatively and quantitatively where we could. Sometimes quite difficult to get hold of quantitative information in order to understand the impact, and that's something we'd really like to think more about in the future. But the types of things we were thinking about really here were the impacts on the assets themselves. So what was required to repair or remediate assets as a result of some of the events that could occur in the future, and also the impacts on transport users and the wider economy. So as you can imagine, that can be quite difficult to calculate if you have a landslide that closes a road for a period of time. There are a whole range of impacts there, and that ranges from safety of life to people not being able to go about their day-to-day, and has important economic consequences. So that was the process we used for the climate risk assessment stage, and that enabled us to produce another set of outputs that I will share now. So we were able to produce mapped outputs again for the UKCP18 data mapped to the trunk road network. That you can see on the left-hand slide there, the landslide outputs for the 2050s, and you can also see an example of where we've been able to quantify some of those outputs. So the surface water flooding information for the Transport Scotland network on the right-hand side, where we've been able to calculate an estimated annual damage figure using some standard research, and then again we've been able to apply that to the risk scoring. All of that has enabled us to score the risks and to create an overall risk assessment that lines up with the Transport Scotland risk scoring approach, which I showed on the previous slide. I'm just highlighting that back on that slide now. And that enabled us to create an overall hierarchy of risk for Transport Scotland. You can see I've summarised that here into the very high, moderate and very low categories, but each of those would have had a score that sits behind it and enables Transport Scotland to understand how that risk sits in comparison to other business risks that they might be encountering on the road network. We also, as part of this, created a GIS system to enable Transport Scotland to view all of these different data outputs in conjunction with each other. This enabled them to easily compare the present day and the two future periods to look at what the risk looked at, and it enabled them to understand the changes in profile of different hazards, different locations. Within this GIS, we're also able to overlay all of the different hazards that we looked at to enable a total risk score for each area of the trunk road network to be calculated. So again, Transport Scotland could see which part of the trunk road network would be most vulnerable in the future and in the present day. What does all of that mean then for Transport Scotland? That's a lot of data and information, but really the importance of that is to enable them to take action, to begin to adapt the trunk road network further to the climatic conditions that we'll see. Now, as I said at the start, a plan's already in place there, so there's a lot of activity already ongoing, and therefore as part of the adaptation piece we captured the activity that was already happening. We also produced a number of recommendations as to where Transport Scotland might like to focus for further adaptation activity. So we made use of the climate screening and the climate risk assessment outputs to inform the trunk road adaptation plan that we have recommended to Transport Scotland. And we also co-developed these adaptation actions through the stakeholder engagement approach that I mentioned back at the start. And we came up with a number of themes for Transport Scotland to group the actions they may take under. So these were really around safety and safety resilience. For Transport Scotland, it's important that their trunk road network is reliable, safe and resilient to as much climate change impact as they possibly can achieve. So we've prioritised all of these themes and we've looked at whether they should take action in the short, the medium or the long term. We also looked at a number of enabling themes that would enable them to gain greater benefit from their adaptation action. So that might be by partnering more with others who are seeing similar challenges to themselves. A number of the impacts of climate change on the transport network need a little more research and understanding to underpin the development of the adaptation actions. And really, in order to understand how well the transport network is being adapted, it's important to have a good understanding of the network itself, to monitor the network and to monitor the types of incidents that are occurring on the network. So these formed the basis for the adaptation actions that we proposed to Transport Scotland, and we're now starting to talk with them about how they might start to take those actions forward to investigate further some of the areas where they need to adapt and to really prioritise the things that resonate most with their business. That's the end of the presentation that I have for you today. I'd like to invite any questions through the question and answer piece. Thank you.
Michelle, many thanks. Thank you very much for that. There are a number of questions going into the Q&A now. Please don't forget to use the Q&A, not the chat. So if it's okay with you, Michelle, I'll start with the first one that was answered. Or I might take Chair's prerogative on this. You mentioned you categorise flooding as a climate hazard. I'm just looking, bearing in mind the terminology that the IPCC uses about hazard, vulnerability and exposure that forms the propeller diagram that you showed at the start. Is flooding and this is, I don't know the answer to this, I'm just asking this, is flooding a climate hazard or an impact caused by a climate hazard? Because flooding is not always generally related to, there's other factors that may cause flooding.
Yes, indeed. I think flooding is an impact, and as you say, there can be a full range of factors that cause flooding. And actually, as part of this project, that's something that's become very clear. Often, where there is flooding on the network, there has been a weather hazard in the frame, I guess. But there are also much wider factors that are causing that flooding on the ground.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the questions, and also if you do have time when you're asking any questions, please just put your affiliation down. So I'll start off with the first question from George Rees. What is the estimated scale of the problem? For example, the estimated cost of the required adaptation.
So we haven't calculated an overall cost of 100% adaptation across the trunk road network. What we have tried to do is classify a potential scale of impact, and that really depends on whether we're talking about impact on the whole economy, which is very difficult, as I was saying earlier, to kind of calculate, or impact directly on the trunk road network. So I appreciate that's not a full answer to that question, but it's very, very difficult to calculate. It could be as simple as small adaptation actions that might take place in some cases that might cost a few £1,000s, or it may be at the larger end of the scale that we might want to make changes to road schemes and such, and that really depends on the scale of the impacts and the points at which Transport Scotland feel that those different actions might need to be taken. Something that we might use to think about this in future is an adaptive pathway to enable Transport Scotland to help to understand, okay, at what point do we really need to take different actions, and what is the likely financial impact of taking those different actions.
Okay, thank you. A second question from Rachel Allison. Could you talk more about how you set the hazard thresholds, please? For example, how did you tackle harder to define thresholds or assets affected by multiple climate hazards?
Yeah, okay, so there's a few questions in one there. So let's start with the harder to define climate hazards. So we also had the Transport Scotland incident data. So that was able to tell us where events had occurred in the past. But we were also able to make use of previous research and to develop some of the thresholds and validate some of those thresholds. So, for example, for the landslide work, we were able to undertake some validation through other work we were doing as well, so that we understood that the threshold we'd come to was both ground truthing with the incident record, but also was well based in sound science based on the other work that we were doing. We were making use of experts across the team there. So, for example, for landslide, we're making sure we're making use of geo expertise as well as the expertise within the climate resilience team.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Simon Hawkins, your question's been answered if you haven't seen that. It's about where the YouTube video is. Catherine Payne's asked, and Catherine's from Climate Ready South East Scotland, because she says so in a question. Who's been your key contact for Transport Scotland for this work? She's involved in the Climate Ready South East Scotland stuff.
Yeah, I can probably share that offline.
Okay. Alistair Southgate from Transport, someone, I don't know who the expert is. Has there been any attempt to quantify potential costs to users of the network and wider economy? I presume that's of the cost of the actual hazards and the cost of any adaptation and resilience measures.
Yeah, so I think that's work that hasn't really been done nationally or particularly internationally. It's something that we'd like to do a lot more of. We understand obviously the what's the word, the journeys across the transport network, but I think a bit more work would be needed to fully quantify that cost.
Sorry, well, there's so many questions coming in there. Where are we? Right, up to date. How many? Dan Ormsby from Spark Geo. How many hazard indicator data sets did your study create? And is the methodology logic used to create those indicators something that can be shared?
I maybe just need to clarify that question. So you're talking about what, how many different hazards we looked at. We looked at 8 different hazards within the programme. The methodology to develop those was mainly used either public research or we've developed ourselves from the data. Where we've developed it ourselves, it probably would be commercially sensitive.
Thank you. Sam Pollard, this is an interesting one. I'm not sure where Sam's from, but was it possible to verify climate risk data against actual events that were observed? I.e., is the data used able to predict the impacts accurately?
So I think I've talked a little bit about the incident data that we had. So we had incident data that was quite general, and we were able to classify that by hazard and look at whether it performed a kind of good match with the present day climate risk assessment. What's the second part of that question again? Sorry.
Is the data used able to predict impacts accurately?
Impacts accurately.
Now that's a hard question because we're looking into the future and it's very difficult to. And I suppose that's in terms of the variables when we're looking at sort of just the climate data, we've got the models that can verify that, and the observational data is a bit more difficult when you're looking at risks. I think also, Michelle, you picked up a point there, and again, this is probably the same for all organisations about how well they catalogue and record the incidents. Now they'll go, oh yeah, somewhere something happened, and then you go, what exactly happened? They go, well, we have to ask someone, and someone's no longer there, which is often a common problem with many organisations. And I suppose that's something, let's not point any fingers here, unless the Highway Scotland are in this camp. But I think it's a useful thing always to point out, are organisations collecting the information? That's all part of setting up a proper risk assessment, that monitoring and evaluation is in place into the future, not for the performance of any adaptation and resilience measures, but also just recording stuff, making sure that logs, the incident reports are in place.
Yeah, and I think in terms of accurately talking about the future impacts, it really does depend on that. The more information you have, the more accurately you can start to think about the impact. So if we took an asset, for example, if you understand what the things that might affect the failure of an asset, like a bridge, are, then you can start to understand what level of event might cause that failure. But then the piece that's much more difficult to understand is what is the impact on transport users. It would totally depend on the time of day that event occurred. So lots of different factors that would go into accurately predicting that impact. But the more information you have, the more accurate you could be.
Okay. We've got questions up to Martin Lee. And that's going to be the last question because there are quite a few to get through up to Martin's question. Right, Chris Parker. Oh, Climate Change Committee. What limitations and challenges did you find with using the UKCP18 data, and why did you choose to use the probabilistic projections over the other UKCP18 products?
Yeah, so we gave some thought to a range of different products as part of our planning for this piece. In terms of the probabilistic projections, it was felt really that the outputs would give us the right resolution for the transport trunk road network across Transport Scotland, and it also gave us the range of the RCPs that we were aiming to look at. So obviously wanting to focus on the two RCPs 6 and 8.5 that I mentioned at the top. So there was another part to that question as well that I've forgotten.
What are the limitations and challenges with the UKCP18 data? Oh, so we can't talk about that.
So that would be one of the limitations and challenges, actually, the fact that that we're always really wanting to look at multiple RCPs and scenarios, and not all of the data sets are available for those multiple scenarios. So that would be a limitation in use.
Okay, thank you. And then Aoife Fitzpatrick. Hello, Aoife. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for your presentation. Would you usually look at climate extremes data from UKCP18 when undertaking climate risk assessments?
That really depends on the client specification, but ideally, yes, we would look at extremes data, and we would try to perform extreme value analysis where that was deemed important to the client, so that they can understand magnitude as well as frequency of events.
Okay, thank you for that, Aoife. Oh, and Fi That's asking a question. I'm on this same level as, not same level, sorry, because Pi's far higher up than me. Could you describe how you approached the conversation you had with Transport Scotland on choosing the emission scenarios, the RCPs that you chose, 6 and 8.5?
I can't actually. I didn't join the project at an early enough stage to have been part of that conversation.
Do you know who specified that? Was that something you recommended, or was that Transport Scotland?
I believe it was client specified.
Okay. So yeah, probably just should have used the 8.5. Anyway, that's Transport Scotland. I hope that picked up the point there, Fi, because I'm sort of along the same lines as you. I'm not sure why you do 6 and 8.5. This is Lee Phillips from Balfour Beatty. Has climate change action, both planned or possible, been taken into account when looking at the risk? For any pre-adaptation, any measures that are already in place to adapt and build resilience to climate risk?
Yes, there were existing strategies in place to enable the management of the risk, and certainly within the risk register and the risk rating approach, we were looking at those, and we were also using those to inform the adaptation piece. So several of the meteorological hazards already had existing management plans in place, and we reviewed all of those as part of this project.
That's a really good perspective. That I think, from an academic point of view, that's something, the effectiveness of adaptation strategies and response options is something that they can spend an inordinate amount of time talking about. If you ever sit around an IPCC chapter meeting, yeah, you can lose a lot of your life. Anyway, bringing back memories. Tanu Patnayak, could you provide more details, data source, resolution, time period about the landslide data?
So for landslide, we were using some freely available BGS geoshore data, and we were also creating some specific thresholds that were related to rainfall.
Okay, and just bear with me while I'm just going. Right, okay, how are we doing? Okay, I'll maybe just let a few more questions go on after Martin's. What flooding likelihood scenarios did you use with the SEPA flood maps? That's from Lee Martin.
Yeah, so we were looking at the 1 in 200 SEPA flood maps, and I would need to check on the likelihood.
And right, I'll do a question from Mohammed and then final one from
I think it was medium.
Sorry?
I think it was a medium risk floodplain.
Okay. Sorry, so from Mohammed Ali from it's carbon specialist at Northern Trains. Was there consideration for compound weather hazards impacting assets and transport?
Yeah, so we did look at cascading risks as part of this as a sort of 9th hazard. We did as much as we could with the cascading risks with the information that we had available. We were aware of several historic events where there had been a cascade of risk, and we did do some analysis work to highlight to Transport Scotland what some of the most significant cascades were likely to be. I think I also mentioned within the risk assessment we were able to kind of overlay the different risks to look at the most vulnerable parts of the network, but certainly more work should be done in this area.
Right, thank you. And then final question from Yuting Chen, who's from EDF. Thank you for the talk. Are the climate scores coming out of the screening process comparable across hazards?
Within the screening process, yes, they should be comparable across hazards. Yeah,
that should be. Yeah, that should be correct. That's how you can prioritise and rank them as well. So thank you for all those questions. Just one final point. I've just posted in the Q&A a link to an IPCC concept note on it's a guidance note, sorry, on the concept of risk and how that's addressed in IPCC reports. And it's based on all draws. It comes out of the IPCC propeller diagram that Michelle showed early on in the talk, and I'm a big advocate of that propeller diagram and that methodology and framework. I think it's very simplistic and elegant way of demonstrating and categorizing risk, and it has something been poorly modified in the AR6 to some extent, but the original one with the three main categories is very important. And again, it's dynamic. We can't take away the fact that the hazard, the vulnerability, and exposure all change over time, and that means the risk will change over time. And that's the important bit about the circular approach to risk that Michelle showed at the start. And how monitoring and evaluation is part of any recommendations that clients should take on board, because they have to look at the effectiveness of their strategies and take into account new science, new evidence, and any other changes that are occurring. So, Michelle, thank you very much. Very much appreciated for that. I think now, there we go. Look at that. Perfect timing. The next webinar, 20th of June. It's less than a month away. So we have Denise Dukey. I'm not sure where Denise is from. So informing adaptation, how do UK organisations view and use climate information? And then David Sexton from the Met Office, describing future UK precipitation in terms of changes in local circulation patterns. May go to some extent to why it's been so wet, and my wife isn't very happy with the weather at the moment, so I might get her to listen to that. So thank you very much for that. Any other points, please pick up. There's the emails, and I hope we've addressed all the comments about where the video and recordings will be found. And I can't thank Michelle enough for giving up her time and to talk about her work. Many thanks. And also, I might get told off for this, but if anyone, we do solicit presentations from anyone in the network. So if you've got any ideas, suggestions, or you want to put yourself forward, please do get in touch. Not with me, because I'm just get in touch with Fi. And the UKCP team, and we'll get that organised. But I think it's a very valuable resource, and thank you for the Met Office staff. Even though, I repeat again, I'm not associated with the Met Office, thank you for their time and effort and all their excellent work. And I think as well, we've got to be honest amongst ourselves here. We're very fortunate. We've got an exceptionally well-resourced UK Met Office that enables us to have this fantastic set of data. It's unique in the world, and the effort and the scientists that are involved in the Met Office who, spent their life doing this research is really, it's a very extremely valuable resource for us, and that we mustn't overlook it too much. So thank you very much.